Our keynote speaker tonight is Msgr William Fay, and he is a priest from the Archdiocese of Boston. He's a native of Boston, Massachusetts. He was ordained to the priesthood in 1974, and he's ministered in a variety of different parish assignments. So, Msgr Fay, we're thrilled to have you, and you're going to be talking to us about those older vocations. Welcome to Serra Meets.
Thank you so much, Ann. And thanks to all of you for the commitment that you've made to vocations. There are a lot of people out there that are promoting vocations, but I think the fact that you do it the way that you do, both within the United States and internationally, is just such a great grace. So thank you so much for all of that. It's so deeply appreciated. Tonight, I'd like to talk about if I am going to, and I should mention this, by the way, I'm going to be speaking from notes that I can make available to whoever you would recommend, Ann, if anybody wants to have a copy of the notes for later or for further reference. But my topic tonight is going to be on the genius and necessity of older vocations to the priesthood. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to mention two things as a kind of context to four things that I'm going to mention in terms of issues that I think you want to be aware of with respect to older vocations. So there's six little parts to this, and I'm going to turn now to the first two. And the first is, our seminary was founded in 1964 by Cardinal Richard Cushing. And that's really important because one of the things you need to know about this man was that he had incredibly great vision and foresight. And I'm going to give you a couple of other examples besides this seminary that'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about. First of all, in 1958, we were ordaining more than 50 priests a year in Boston. And Cardinal Cushing realized that we weren't going to need all of those priests. And so he decided that we should set up a missionary society to be able to help Catholics in Latin America who didn't have as many priests at the time. And he called it the St. James Society. And what he did was he asked priests of Boston who were ordained at least 5 years to make a minimum of a 5-year commitment to be missionaries in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru. And there were many, many Boston priests and priests from other countries, like Ireland in particular, who became affiliated with the St. James Society, and they've done extraordinary work within Latin America. Today, we don't have enough priests to send to all three countries, so they only go to Peru. And you'll be interested to know that a number of these priests ended up getting to know then Father and Bishop Robert Prevost, who is now Pope Leo XIV, which is extraordinary. A second thing that Cardinal Cushing did that I'm really grateful for after 52 years in the priesthood is he set up a retirement home, a nursing home, and a hospice for priests. He did that in 1964. And that house is able to accommodate about 70 priests. And for the past 15, 20, 30 years, it's been absolutely full. Look at the vision that he had, knowing what the diocese was going to need, knowing what the church was going to need. In the same year, 1964, Cardinal Cushing saw that there were older vocations out there. And just before the council began, he went to Pope John the 23rd and he asked him for his blessing on the building of a seminary for these men who were older candidates to the priesthood. And John the 23rd, without reserve, said, yes, go ahead and do this. Now, we remember that John the 23rd died in June of 1963. The seminary opened in 1964, and Cardinal Cushing, to his credit, named the seminary after him because of his generosity in terms of doing that. The first class from Pope St. John, older men, were ordained in 1968. So in a couple of years, we'll be celebrating the 60th anniversary of our first alums. Excuse me. To date, we have more than 750 alumni from here. We've had as many as 70 men in the seminary. Now we have more or less 40. We'd like to have about 60 seminarians. But I want to mention we're the only seminary in the United States that is committed for older candidates, forming them exclusively for the parochial ministry. So it's a unique ministry. There are two other seminaries. There's Holy Apostles in Connecticut, and there is Hales Corner in Wisconsin. But they've expanded their interest with respect to seminary for laity and lay formation, and also for formation of men who happen to be younger. So that's the first context I want to give you. The second context I want to give you is just a brief history of seminary formation. With the notable exception of St. John, Jesus chose seasoned men for his apostles. They all had positions and professions from which they left to live with and under Jesus for 3 years. That's pretty much how priestly formation took place for centuries. The whole first millennium of the church, men were formed for priesthood by bishops immediately or by senior priests that the bishops, appointed. You may or may not know that St. Augustine, for example, was 36 years old when he was ordained a priest. He had a really rocky and rough young life. But finally, when he came around, it was really Ambrose of Milan, St. Ambrose, the Archbishop of Milan, who really formed him. Around the year 1000, 1200, with the rise of universities and monasteries in the scholastic period, we see some priestly formation taking place there, but it's more academic than pastoral. And in fact, because it was, the priests that were being formed were really not at the apex of what formation should be. So in the 1500s, when the Council of Trent took place, one of their big concerns was to institute seminaries as we know them today, places where men would come together and be formed academically, pastorally, intellectually, but also in human ways as well. Okay. And so the majority of our candidates today are formed in seminaries. But I want to make this point. The majority of candidates today are younger men. They're mostly 20-year-olds. Now, when I say majority, I'm talking about maybe 65, 70%. My estimation is that 25 to 35% of candidates today are over 30. And I'm going to make a point about that in a little bit. So those are two background pieces. One, the great vision of Richard Cushing to set up a place like this. And secondly, that the seminary formation, you may not be aware, these seminaries as we know them today have only been around for about 500 years. What are some of the issues that I think are important for us to talk about and to mention? First of all, what are the advantages of having older candidates to the priesthood? I'm going to mention 4. First of all, they're seasoned, they're settled. These men, 30 and plus, have lived life and have accepted who they are. Unlike younger men, by and large, they're not competitive. I don't know how you remember yourselves in your 20s, but most of us lived in a way in which we weren't settled yet and had to prove ourselves to others in terms of what our competencies or what we thought they were would be. Okay? In the seminary now, these men don't live like that. Peer support here is very strong among older candidates. Now, I can tell you this from experience. I taught 14 years at St. John's Seminary in Boston, which was for younger candidates. And the competition there was always significant. And we had to help guys kind of tone that down a bit. I have not, in the 8 years that I've been here at Pope St. John the 23rd, I haven't seen that at all. A second thing that we see These candidates, the older candidates, bring a wealth of life experience and life understanding to the priesthood, and they greatly nourish the presbyterates to which they belong. They're a very healthy group to mix with priests, many of whom are younger. The skills that these men bring as older candidates are both practical and they're intellectual. For example, we see a lot of blue-collar workers who come to the priesthood, a lot of men who come through medicine, counseling, teaching, law, business, Wall Street executives. It's a whole huge mix. And what's interesting? When these men come here, there is not a hierarchy among the candidates at all. No matter where it is that you come from, these guys get to know each other. They get to be supportive of each other. And what's really interesting about it, there is no kind of rank among them whatsoever because of the different backgrounds that they happen to have. I found that just extraordinary. I don't know, maybe some of you would have some examples of it. I just can't think of another place where people are prepared professionally where that kind of mix just happens. A third thing, whereas younger priests in many ways need to earn the respect, these are the advantages of an older candidate, where younger priests in many respects need to earn the respect and trust of their parishioners, older men, because of their experience, receive that regard from parishioners much more quickly. I see that in the assignments that we provide for these men in pastoral ministry. They go in naturally because they go into these works with callers that called a father. They'll immediately and always say, no, 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 I'm not ordained yet. But there's a great respect that's given to them. And even after priesthood, they have a much, much easier way. I remember as a young priest, growing up, I had a baby face, but I was blessed by the time I was 27, 28 to start having gray hair. So that when I arrived in the priesthood, I looked a little older than I really did. And they just thought I was an older guy with a young face. So I didn't find myself as challenged. But I know the younger guys really do feel challenged that they have not yet really settled in. I want to mention this. This is a fourth point about advantages. 93% of the men with us get ordained. That's extraordinary. And then of those ordained, 94% remain priests until death. Now, let me give you the example of my own theologate. When I started theology in 1970, 72 of us got ordained. 26% of the ordained left the priesthood. That means that we had an attrition rate of 54%. More than half of the guys who started with me in seminary ended up leaving seminary or later the priesthood. And I want to give you that number against 93% of the guys who start seminary with us get ordained, and then 94% of them remain priests till death. There's something going on in older candidates that we really need to pay attention to. They're survivors. And I'll have a reason to explain that to you momentarily. A last thing, one of the things that we're beginning to notice now is that when a man becomes a permanent deacon, he has to make a commitment to one marriage. He can live in the marriage that he's currently in, but if he loses his spouse to death or sadly to divorce, he cannot go on and do anything else. We now have bishops who are realizing that some of those men who find themselves in that situation could become very fine priests. And in the last 10 years, we've had 10 to 12 men who were permanent deacons who came through our program and went on to become priests. And that for us here is not a 4-year program, which is what the ordinary program is for priesthood, but it's a 3-year program because we acknowledge the fact that they had a program to get themselves as permanent deacons. Okay? So those are some of the advantages that I see in our paying attention to older candidates for the priesthood. What are the challenges that we see for older candidates? I mentioned 2 here. One is what I call the uprooting. And what I mean by that is these candidates have to move from one way of life to another, and that is a great challenge. If the men, for example, have families, they've got to make sure that their children are old enough to take care of themselves. That's a real challenge for them. They're involved in selling a house, a property. They're balancing the time it takes to get through a diocesan acceptance program. And by the way, that's been a real challenge for our guys. Some of these programs of acceptance just take a long time, and it may not be till June 1st or July 1st that a vocation director will say to a man, yes, the bishop is ready to accept you. Well, that's a challenge because he's got these other things that he's got to do to separate, and he's got to give the work that he's doing now a sufficient notice of departure. So those are real challenges that our men face. A second challenge they face is what we call the imposter syndrome. You may or may not have heard of that before. That's the thinking that I really do not belong preparing as a priest, and someone's bound to catch up on me sometime. The guys come here, and for whatever reason, they start thinking, am I really worthy of this? Am I an imposter or a fraud that someone's going to catch some way down the line? Now, I want to mention very honestly, with good faculty and peer support, the men do get over this. In fact, I want to go back to recall the attrition rates. The men here, 93% are going to get ordained. So while they do struggle with that along the way, um, most of the guys don't have any difficulty with that over time. I remember one time a very significant candidate, a real professional, was a man who was extremely successful in his own work before he came here, said to me one day in formation, Monsignor, I don't know if I belong here, and I wonder if I should go back to what I was doing. And I said to him, I want you to think about that for a few moments. And he said, why? I said, because if you were happy what you were doing, you would never have left it. I want you to go back and think about, why are you here? It's obvious that it involved not just a desire that you had, but that you were feeling a pull from the Lord in a certain kind of way. If you went back, what's the guarantee that you wouldn't leave it again sometime because it wasn't as satisfying or fulfilling? A third challenge that a third thing that we want to know about these candidates is we need to encourage older candidates. And I want to be very clear about this. Most people, especially bishops and vocation directors, think of candidates for the priesthood as being younger men. And they often say this publicly. I've heard many, many bishops and vocations. If you know a young man who you think would be a good priest, we want to ask you to encourage him. We need to get beyond this attitude. As I mentioned to you earlier, a fair estimate, and it's based on CARA, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate. Their data tells me that 25 to 35% of today's candidates are over 30. They're there. Now, we're not seeing them at Pope St. John's, and why? Because bishops are sending them into communities that are younger, into seminaries that are younger. So I want to make the point that these older candidates belong in their own environment with their own peer group. We need to get bishops and vocation directors to become more convinced of this. And I'd like to encourage you folks at Serra to talk to vocation directors and saying, how are you dealing with your older candidates? Now, some bishops, and rightfully so, they have the right, are able to say, we're not going to accept candidates over a certain age. But the fact of the matter is that, as I mentioned to you early, there are some really tremendous advantages of accepting these fellows. And the last point I want to make, and then we can have a discussion, is if you see a man who would be a good candidate for the priesthood, tell him that. Sometimes this is all that's needed. It can be the key to unlock a really beautiful door for the man and for the church. There are lots of men out there who, know that. I talked to a man the other day at the Boston Catholic Men's Conference, and I said to him, what are you doing in work? He's a man, I guess, in his late 30s, early 40s. And he said, I'm in finances. And I said to him, I said, are you enjoying it? And he said, well, I did. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I don't find it satisfying today. And I said, well, why don't you think about what it is that the Lord might want to do with you? Questions like that, I think, can open up wonderful conversations with people. And the experience that these men bring into the priesthood, I think, is extraordinary. So with that, I've given you a kind of round, what's the context for thinking about this issue? And what are four major issues that are important within them? I know that Matt Yogas is on the conversation with us. I don't know if Matt would want to make any further comment on what I said, but I'm certainly open to questions and conversation and discussion.
John, can you put Matt on the panel? Okay, but Monsignor, I have a question that someone just asked.
Sure.
And it refers back to the story that you told about the gentleman who thought he wasn't worthy. And the question is, did he stay?
Yes. Yes, he did.
Okay.
Yes, he did. The guy, well, first of all, it might have been a mix of two things. There are the men who think that they're not worthy, and that's the so-called imposter syndrome. And then there was the guy that said to me, I don't know if I should stay here or go back to my profession. I was really quite successful. And it was to that fellow that I said directly, if you were happy there, you never would have left it.
Mhm.
Most guys, and he's ordained, happily ordained, 5 years ordained this coming spring.
Yeah. Another statement from, let's see, this is Kansas City, St. Joseph, Missouri, mentions that Nicholas, a first-year seminarian at John the 23rd, was a teacher at their diocesan visitation parish, and then he's just sort of discerning his second career. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. And Matt is actually on right now.
Good.
Matt,
Let me say a word about Nicholas. Nicholas Shump is in his first year and is doing really quite well. And I have a classmate from Kansas City, St. Joseph, Missouri, a fellow by the name of Father Joe Mott. And we'll be celebrating 52 years of priesthood this summer. And again, Joe is one of the, what would I call it? The 46% that stayed through the seminary and stayed faithful in priesthood.
wonderful. Matt, can you just introduce yourself? You have to unmute. And I think you've got
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can.
All right. Well, thank you, Monsignor, and thank you, Anne. It's good to be back. I see a lot of familiar faces here in the chat. It's good to be with Serra. For those of you who don't know, I did a lot of vocations work for the last 12 years with Beyond Vocations, and I guess it took me a while to figure out my path in life, but I'm so happy to be a seminarian now. And just all I wanted to add is the awareness is the big thing. Monsignor mentioned it, but there are working in vocations. There are a lot of bishops and vocation directors out there who just aren't aware of this seminary and the idea of sending men in their 40s and 50s to the same place to be formed together. And I don't know where I'd be right now if it weren't for this place. It just wasn't a thought in my mind that I can't go to a place with a bunch of 20-year-olds and do a propedeutic year. And this place really opened up my eyes to the possibility that this might actually be where God's calling me. So I know all of you have relationships with priests and vocation directors and bishops, and yeah, just help us make sure they know about this place because it's the best thing that's ever happened to me being here. And I just want to share that with as many people as I can.
Thank you. Thank you. And Matt, do you have a summer assignment?
I'll be back home in the Diocese of Savannah, actually at my home parish. I was blessed to find that out just a couple of weeks ago. I'll be at St. Matthew's in Statesboro, Georgia for my summer assignment.
Wonderful. And Deacon David Flynn is asking, is there a minimum age for accepting candidates into Pope St. John the 23rd?
We traditionally say 30, but it depends on the bishop. We've had fellows. We have a fellow that's going to be ordained a priest this year that came to us in his late 20s because the bishop recognized some characteristics, dimensions of the person that made this place a better fit for him than would have been a seminary with younger candidates.
All right. Thank you so much, Monsignor. This was wonderful to hear about older vocations. And I'm so thrilled that Matt was able to put his 2 cents in. And all of us are praying for you, Matt. And we know you're doing well. God bless.